My son and his wife said they trusted me. They asked me to watch their house while they were away, just for a week. They smiled as they left, even gifted me a bottle of wine, but they forgot to turn off the cameras. Or perhaps they didn't want to. At first, I didn't realize I was being recorded, but then I found the footage. Jessica's voice, laughing as she called me, the old babysitter who'll put up with anything. That's when it hit me. This wasn't trust. It was a test. But I wasn't the quiet one anymore. Not this time. This time, the cameras didn't capture me. They exposed them. My name is Lauren Bennett. I was 66 years old and had spent most of my adult life as a school librarian in a quiet town outside Boston. Books were my sanctuary, silence my rhythm. I liked systems and order. I liked tea at the same time each morning, and I liked knowing where everything belonged. After my husband passed, the quiet became heavier, but it was familiar. I lived alone in the house we'd bought together until the stairs became too much and the winters felt too long. My son Adam and his wife Jessica had offered a solution that, on the surface, sounded generous. "Why don't you move in with us?" they had asked. "We have space. It'll be easier for everyone." I hesitated at first. I didn't want to intrude, but they insisted. They said it was family, that I would still have privacy, that the kids would love having me around. And so I moved into their home, a large, modern two-story house in a suburb north of Providence. It was beautiful, efficient, sleek, too sleek at times. White countertops, brushed steel appliances, echoing hallways with no clutter, no photos, no softness. The walls were painted in tones of bone and ash, the art abstract and cold. I had my own room on the first floor with a door that closed but didn't really separate me from the rest of the house. Not when Jessica always had opinions about what I stored in the closet, or how I folded the towels, or whether I used the good hand soap in the guest bathroom. Still, I tried to make it work. I picked up the children from school. I did the dishes without being asked. I took care not to leave a trace of myself in the shared spaces. It was a strange dance, being helpful without becoming visible, being present without being a presence. Jessica always smiled at me, but it was the kind of smile that stayed frozen just under the surface of her skin. Her eyes never smiled with her mouth. Then, one Wednesday morning in early May, she knocked on my door. She was already dressed in linen, holding a tablet in one hand and a mug in the other. She said they were going to Hawaii for a week. Just her and Adam, no kids. A couple's getaway, something they hadn't done in years. "We trust you," she said, "and honestly, we'd rather you stay here than be alone at your age." She smiled that practiced smile again, and I nodded. She told me the fridge would be stocked. The garden needed light watering, and I could treat the house like my own. She even left me a bottle of Merlot on the counter with a note in neat, perfect script. "For your quiet evenings. Thank you for everything, Lauren." I should have felt grateful. I should have been touched. Instead, I felt something else, something I couldn't quite name at the time. Not fear, not suspicion, just a subtle unease, like standing in a room that had been cleaned too thoroughly, where even the air felt scrubbed. The morning they left, Jessica hugged me stiffly. Adam kissed me on the cheek. The children waved sleepily from the car. I stood on the porch and watched them drive away, the tires humming down the smooth street. And then, just like that, I was alone. Or so I thought. Inside, the house was silent. I wandered through the kitchen, ran my hand over the cool marble of the island, glanced at the wine on the counter. I opened the fridge. Everything was indeed stocked, down to pre-cut vegetables in labeled containers. The blinds were half drawn, letting in morning light that stretched across the pristine hardwood floors. I stood in the center of the living room, taking in the silence. It should have felt peaceful, but there was something sterile about it, something curated, as if the house had been staged, not lived in, as if someone might come in at any moment to inspect it. I shook the feeling off. I told myself I was being silly. I was in a beautiful house, with a garden, with books, with time. I made tea. I sat in my favorite chair by the window. I picked up my book. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Not in the usual sense, not in the creaks and sighs of an old house, but in the sense that the house itself was watching, and I hadn't yet realized just how right I was. The first day passed peacefully enough. I spent the morning in the garden, pruning the lavender and trimming the edges of the rose bushes near the fence. The air was warm but mild, and the sun filtered through the young spring leaves overhead in soft golden patches. I wore the straw hat Adam had given me 2 birthdays ago, the one I was sure Jessica thought was too country for her modern aesthetic. But in their absence, I didn't worry about being proper. I let my knees rest in the dirt and hummed softly to myself as I worked. Inside, the house remained spotless. I wiped my shoes before entering, careful not to disturb the floors. It was habit more than necessity. I'd spent so long trying to keep my presence in this house invisible that it took conscious effort to relax. I turned on the kettle, picked out a lemon ginger tea bag, and placed it gently in the ceramic mug with the chip on the rim, the only one in the cabinet that seemed used. The others all looked like museum pieces, untouched, unblemished. I drank slowly by the kitchen window, watching birds skip across the patio stones. The house was quiet, peaceful, almost too peaceful. I remember wondering if it always felt that way, or if the stillness had simply grown sharper in the absence of voices and footsteps. I took a slow walk through the downstairs rooms, just wandering, taking in the space I usually tiptoed around. The dining room was laid out like a magazine page, silver flatware glinting in its drawer, folded linen napkins stored with mathematical precision. The living room smelled faintly of eucalyptus and lemon, probably from one of Jessica's diffusers. The books on the shelves were color-coded and mostly decorative. I picked one up. The pages were stiff, unread. The guest bathroom lights turned on automatically when I stepped inside. The mirror was spotless. I looked at my own reflection a little longer than usual. My eyes looked tired, I noticed, but also alert, almost curious, as though I were waiting for something. That night, I made a simple dinner, soup and toast. I ate in silence, then washed the dishes and dried them immediately. I read for an hour in the living room, then returned to my bedroom to finish a crossword. And then, as I climbed into bed, I noticed it, a faint red light in the corner of the ceiling, blinking. At first, I assumed it was part of a smoke detector or a security alarm, but the blinking was rhythmic, alive, a small, persistent eye in the dark. I turned off the lamp and stared up at it. It was too small to be a smoke alarm, too high to be a typical camera, but I'd worked in a school long enough to know what a surveillance device looked like. The longer I stared, the more certain I became. I pulled the comforter up to my chin and lay still, heart slow but alert. I told myself not to overreact. Perhaps they'd installed cameras for security. It was a big house. Maybe they worried about break-ins. Maybe it was normal. But why hadn't they told me? And why was it in the guest room? The next morning, I tried to dismiss the thought. I went for a walk. I stopped at the corner bakery and bought a croissant. I sat at the park and watched a woman teach her child how to ride a bike. For a few moments, I let myself forget. But when I returned, the house felt different, not just quiet, tense, like something waiting. I started noticing other things, the sound of a soft click when I entered the laundry room, the motion sensor that lit up a hallway even in daylight, the way Alexa suddenly chimed after a sentence I spoke out loud to myself in the kitchen, and the small, offhand comment Jessica had made last month. "We love our smart home. It listens better than the kids." That night, I stood under the blinking light in my bedroom. I pulled over a chair and climbed up. I looked closely, and I saw it. A pinhole lens. Subtle, hidden in what looked like a smoke alarm. But it wasn't one. It was a camera. And then it occurred to me. It had probably been recording the entire time. I stepped down slowly. My fingers were trembling, but not from fear, from realization. This wasn't about security. This was surveillance of me. Whatever peace I had begun to feel cracked under that tiny blinking light. I stood in the center of the room and looked around. How many more were there? How long had they been on? And why did Jessica smile so carefully when she handed me that wine? The house was quiet, but now it felt like it was listening and watching, and I no longer felt like a guest. I felt like a subject in someone else's experiment. I didn't sleep much that night. I lay under the covers, eyes fixed on the little red light above me, blinking like a metronome. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined someone watching. Jessica on a beach, sipping a cocktail, casually opening an app on her phone and watching me shift in bed, seeing what I wore, how I moved, noticing the way I muttered to myself when I read, seeing when I cried, if I cried. The next morning, I brewed coffee on autopilot. My thoughts felt like loose marbles rolling inside my skull. I tried to keep my hands steady as I sipped from my chipped mug, staring at the quiet living room. My stomach was in knots, but I knew one thing for sure. I had to find the rest of the cameras. I began in the living room. Slowly, methodically, I walked the perimeter of the space, pretending to dust. I scanned every corner, every electronic device, every bookshelf. There was a small circular object tucked among the fake books, its lens masked by a decorative black sticker. Another one disguised as a motion detector in the corner of the ceiling. I moved to the kitchen. There, inside what looked like a modern kitchen timer mounted above the fridge, I spotted another lens. Small, barely noticeable unless you were looking. But now that I knew what to look for, I couldn't stop seeing them. In the dining room, a camera hidden inside the light fixture, aimed directly at the table. In the hallway, a sleek black dot inside the thermostat. In the laundry room, another tiny eye watching from the shelf above the dryer. I felt the walls closing in. I made a list. I wrote down each camera's location in a small notebook I found in the junk drawer. I wrote quietly, carefully. I moved like a ghost through the house. I was no longer the house guest. I was a detective inside a crime scene. Then I reached the upstairs office. The room had always been off limits. Jessica once told me it was where she did freelance work and kept sensitive material. The door was usually locked, but when I turned the knob that day, it gave. I hesitated, then stepped inside. The office was nothing like the rest of the house. It was cluttered, not messy, but busy. Wires ran across the floor, and shelves were stacked with labeled boxes and tech equipment. On the desk sat a laptop, a monitor, and a small console blinking with green and amber lights. I sat down slowly in front of the computer. It was open. No password prompt. The desktop background was a photo of the kids on a hiking trail. There were folders on the desktop, one named Logs, one named Footage. I opened the second. Inside, the files were named by date and location. Kitchen 2024, May 9th. Living room 2024, May 8th. Guest room 2024, May 7th. I clicked one. The video opened silently. It was me, sitting in the living room, reading a book. I watched myself sip tea, scratch my arm, rub my temples, shift uncomfortably on the cushion. I looked so unaware, so exposed. I closed the file and opened another. There I was again, standing in the kitchen in my robe, washing a dish, staring out the window, mumbling to myself. It was all there. Every moment I thought I was alone. There were hundreds of videos, days, weeks, months. I had no idea how long they'd been recording me. One folder was labeled Clips. Inside were short videos, some only 10 seconds long, all marked with tags. Weird comments, muttering, crying. They were analyzing me, studying me, categorizing my life like I was some kind of behavioral subject. I stared at the screen, hands frozen over the mouse. Then I clicked on one last video, one that wasn't of me. It was Jessica, sitting in the office, laughing on a video call with someone I didn't recognize. She was holding a glass of wine. Her words were casual, but they landed like stones. She still doesn't realize she's on camera. It's honestly a little sad, she said. I think she talks to herself more than she talks to the kids. It's like she's trying to narrate her loneliness. The person on the other end chuckled. Jessica went on. I'm telling you, it's fascinating. I think we could actually cut together a short documentary. Portrait of the Forgotten Matriarch. I didn't move. I didn't cry. I just sat in that room, in that chair, in that sterile, blinking world they had built around me, and I realized I had been living in a dollhouse, a beautiful, polished dollhouse, where I was the exhibit. I didn't close the folder. I didn't shut the laptop. I left it open, the file still playing, Jessica's voice echoing faintly behind me as I stood. Because now I knew everything I needed to know. They had invited me in, but they never gave me a home. They gave me a glass cage, and I was done performing in it. I closed the door behind me with a softness that came more from instinct than intention. It was the same reflex I had developed long ago when my son was a baby, closing drawers, turning knobs, folding silence around my movements so I wouldn't wake him. But this time, the silence wasn't for comfort. It was for protection. The office felt colder than the rest of the house, though the thermostat read the same. Maybe it was the absence of human warmth, the way the walls seemed to inhale rather than exhale. Nothing about the room felt accidental. Every object had been chosen, placed, and monitored. I stood in the middle of the room, letting my eyes adjust. On the far wall was a sleek black cabinet with two locked drawers. There were cables running from it to a central unit on the desk, a custom rig with multiple ports, blinking like it had its own heartbeat. I approached slowly, studying the configuration. Even in my years at the library, I had never seen anything quite like this setup. To the left, beneath the window, was a filing cabinet. I opened the top drawer. Manuals, warranties, receipts, all neatly labeled. Security equipment, storage subscriptions, surveillance software. There was an invoice from a company I didn't recognize, but the description was clear. Custom remote monitoring package. It listed the house's rooms by name, including mine. They had paid to watch me in real time. I reached into my cardigan pocket and pulled out a flash drive, an old one I had used to store photos of Adam as a child. The irony didn't escape me. I slid it into the USB port of the desktop tower. A prompt blinked to life on the monitor. I began copying everything from the footage folder. It was a simple drag and drop, but it felt like an act of defiance. As the files transferred, I wandered further into the room. The second shelf above the desk held notebooks, not personal diaries, but project logs. One was labeled House Data. Inside were detailed entries, motion triggers, timestamps, keywords. One note said 6:43 p.m. Lauren speaks to herself about the birds. Emotional tone, nostalgic. Another, 10:10 a.m., appears to be looking at wedding photo, possible memory reaction. I wasn't just watched, I was studied. It was clinical, detached, not even cruel, just indifferent. That was somehow worse. I wasn't a family member in these notes. I was a test subject in a behavioral study. On the bottom shelf, I found a black leather binder labeled Security Authorization. Inside were forms, permissions for software access, equipment specs, and one printed page that chilled me, a clause about data sharing for research or media. Purposes. Jessica had signed it. I stared at her signature, neat and even, written in blue ink. It was the same handwriting she used for birthday cards, for grocery lists she left on the fridge. Now it was here, next to a paragraph that gave someone, maybe even more than one person, the right to observe and evaluate me. The files finished transferring. I ejected the flash drive and tucked it deep into my bag, beneath a paperback I had been rereading. Then I paused. There was one last drawer I hadn't opened, the lowest one, on the right side of the desk. I bent down and slid it open. Inside were photo prints of me, dozens of them, captured stills from the cameras. Me in the kitchen, me asleep, me watching TV, me brushing my hair. Some printed in color, some labeled by hand. Lauren, early morning. Lauren, with book. Lauren, crying. I didn't know what broke inside me in that moment, but something did. Not a loud break, not a scream, more like a crack in glass, long and clean and silent, but irreversible. I gathered as many of the photos as I could fit in my purse, not all of them, just enough to prove what I had seen. I wasn't sure yet how I would use them, but I knew I would. I left the rest of the office untouched. Let them wonder what I knew. Let them worry about how far I would go. As I left the room, I caught my reflection in the glass door. I looked older than I remembered, not because of time, but because of knowledge. They had invited me into their home with smiles, but they had never offered me trust. They had built a cage, elegant and invisible, and expected me to live inside it without protest. But they forgot something essential. I had lived a whole life before their cameras, and now I was ready to live another one beyond their reach. The house felt different once I knew what it truly was. The air carried a quiet heaviness, like a room just vacated by someone you hadn't realized was standing behind you. I could no longer walk freely from one room to another without imagining invisible eyes tracking my every step. The click of my heels on the tile, the sound of a chair scraping the floor, each noise echoed with an awareness I hadn't felt before. It wasn't fear exactly, it was clarity, cold, sharp, and merciless. I stopped pretending. For 2 days, I moved through the house in deliberate silence. I unplugged devices under the guise of saving power, casually adjusted picture frames with hidden lenses, draped scarves over suspicious objects. I opened windows I had never touched before. I left the TV on for hours, playing silent black and white films just to throw off their expectations. And when I passed the hallway mirror, I looked at myself, really looked. I wasn't just an aging mother in law in a borrowed home. I was a woman regaining her agency. I knew I had to confront them eventually, but not on their terms, not when I was emotional, not when I felt like prey. So I planned. I printed several of the images I had found, still shots of myself taken from hidden cameras. I included one from the kitchen, one from the bedroom, one where I was reaching into a drawer. The images were quiet, almost boring, but that was what made them so invasive. They captured the small, unguarded moments I had believed were mine alone. I wrote a short note and placed it with the photos in an envelope. Then I mailed it to myself, certified, postmarked. It was a trick I'd learned years ago during a property dispute at the library, a quiet way to timestamp a truth, proof in case this ever went beyond the family. Then I went into the guest room and filmed myself speaking. It wasn't dramatic. I didn't shout. I sat in the armchair by the window, the one Jessica always moved an inch to the left whenever I straightened it. I looked directly into the lens of the only camera I hadn't touched. And I talked. I talked about the feeling of being invited with kindness and treated with suspicion. I talked about the loneliness of being helpful, yet constantly watched. I talked about the absurdity of being turned into a specimen in a home where I'd been asked to feel safe. And then I said the most important part. I was done participating, not just in the performance, but in the contract I never agreed to. The unspoken agreement that I would remain small, silent, and compliant in exchange for proximity to family. The video was 10 minutes long. I ended it with a simple sentence. I have always been more than you chose to see. Then I uploaded it to a private drive and sent the link to my personal email, along with John's, my former coworker at the library, who now worked in family law. I hadn't spoken to him in years, but he had always told me, if you ever need anything, you call me. It was time. With the digital and physical evidence secured, I began to reclaim the house in subtle ways. I cooked breakfast and left the scent lingering. I played classical music in the early afternoon and let the echoes fill every corner. I pulled my knitting bag from the closet and worked in the living room without apology. I lit candles. I walked barefoot. I took long, meandering phone calls with old friends and laughed loudly when I wanted to. It was not rebellion. It was declaration. I wasn't waiting for their return anymore with fear. I was waiting with resolve. On the morning of their scheduled arrival, I made coffee and placed the printed photos neatly on the kitchen counter. I stood in the hallway and looked up at the tiny lens in the ceiling. I smiled, not warmly, not kindly, just honestly. Then I turned and walked outside, took the garden hose, and watered the roses, slowly, with care, the way I had always done things, quietly, patiently, precisely. That night, they walked through the door, sunburned and smug from their vacation, expecting the same quiet woman they had left behind. But I wasn't that woman anymore, and the cameras would show them everything they needed to know. They pulled into the driveway just after sunset. I was already seated in the garden with a cup of tea, the same way I had been on the day they left. The sky was turning a deep shade of violet, and the porch light had just flickered on. I didn't stand to greet them. I didn't wave. I simply sipped my tea and watched their silhouettes climb out of the car, their voices muffled through the hedges. Jessica's laughter rang sharp and bright, the kind she used when she wanted to sound carefree. Adam followed her with the rolling suitcase, his head turned toward the front door. They didn't see me at first. I heard the keys jingle, the familiar click of the front door unlocking, the soft creak as it swung open. Then there was silence, not a natural pause, but the kind that comes when something expected has shifted, a deviation. a presence. Jessica's voice broke the hush, lower now, uncertain. Adam said something, probably asked what was wrong. I imagined the scene, the kitchen lights on, the photos on the counter, my handwritten note resting beside them, the cameras still in place but no longer their secret. They didn't call my name. I stayed outside, watching the garden darken around me. The tea had gone cold in my cup, but I held it anyway. It steadied me. After what felt like 15 minutes, Adam stepped outside. His eyes scanned the yard until he saw me. He hesitated, then walked over slowly. His face was blank, not angry, not confused, just empty, like he hadn't yet decided which version of himself to be. He asked if we could talk. I nodded and gestured to the chair across from mine. He sat stiffly, folding his hands together in his lap. There was a pause, one of those heavy silences that begged to be filled, but I waited. I wanted to hear what version of the truth he would offer. He began with the usual, that it wasn't personal, that the cameras were for security, that they'd forgotten to disable them while they were gone. He said it all with the flatness of someone who'd practiced the lines on the way home, who was hoping to land somewhere between apology and justification. I didn't interrupt. He continued, saying they didn't think I'd be uncomfortable, that I was family, and they would never spy on me. Then he said the word that finally made me speak. He said, trust. I asked him, softly, slowly, if he would feel trusted knowing someone recorded his private moments for months without telling him. I asked if he would call that protection or manipulation. He didn't answer right away. Jessica came out then, her mouth tight, arms crossed. She didn't sit. She stood behind Adam and said she was hurt. Hurt that I would snoop through their things, that I would dig, that I would send files to an attorney. So she knew. I looked at her and said that if she felt hurt by being found out, perhaps she should consider how I felt being studied in my most vulnerable moments. I reminded her of the room I wasn't allowed to enter, the signatures on the data agreements, the names of the video files labeled with words like crying and off behavior. Her face twitched, but she didn't argue. I said I wasn't looking for an apology. I wasn't even angry anymore. I was resolved, and I was done. I told them I had secured a consultation with a lawyer, that my investments in their home would be documented and repaid. I told them I had copies of all the footage, the equipment logs, and even a backup set of files stored with a trusted friend. Jessica started to say something defensive, but Adam put his hand on her arm. For the first time, he looked at me, not like a son trying to manage his mother, but like a man realizing he had underestimated someone he thought he knew. He asked what I wanted. I told him the truth. I wanted space, legal, physical, emotional. I wanted a place of my own again, somewhere I could exist without being recorded, managed, or diminished. I wanted dignity, and if they couldn't offer it freely, I would claim it myself. There was another silence, this one different, quieter. Adam said he understood. Jessica didn't speak again. She turned and walked inside. I stood up, left my empty cup on the table, and walked past Adam toward the house. He didn't follow. I went to the guest room, closed the door, and began to pack. There wasn't much. A few sweaters, books, some letters from old friends, the blanket I'd had since college. I didn't want their things. I wanted mine. I slept that night with the blinds open, the moonlight spilling across the floor. I didn't check the ceiling for cameras. I didn't need to. I knew what I needed now, and I knew that the next time I walked out of that house, I would never walk back in the same way again, because something had shifted, and they would never again look at me as someone who stayed quiet. I had been silent, but I was never blind. I spent the next few days with purpose, a quiet but resolute rhythm shaping each hour. I moved through the house with a different posture, not cautious, not submissive, but measured. I was no longer a guest in someone else's version of family. I was a woman calculating her exit. The morning after our conversation in the garden, I called John. He picked up on the second ring, his voice warm and familiar. I hadn't spoken to him in years, but some friendships don't fade. They just rest quietly until you need them. I told him everything in plain terms. No dramatics, just the facts, the surveillance, the breach of trust. The years I'd poured into their home, into the grandchildren, into keeping peace. He listened without interrupting. Then he asked me to email the files. He said we could start with a property review, that we'd build from there. You don't need to burn the house down, he said. You just need to show them you own part of the foundation. I liked that. It stayed with me. By the end of the week, we had drafted a proposal. It wasn't a threat. It was a boundary, a legal assertion of the role I had played in their lives and their finances. I had contributed to the down payment on their home 5 years ago. Jessica had framed it as a gift, but we had no paperwork, only a wire transfer and a series of emails in which she thanked me for investing in our future. That phrase would prove useful. John wrote a letter, professional, measured, but firm. It outlined my investment, the estimated value adjusted for inflation, and the property's appreciation. It proposed either repayment or a formal equity stake that could be converted into a housing allowance for a separate residence. I handed the sealed envelope to Adam one evening while he stood in the doorway of the guest room. He didn't open it right away. He looked tired, not from guilt, I suspected, but from the weight of realization, from finally seeing me not as a fixture in the home, but as someone who had kept the house running from the shadows. Jessica didn't speak to me that week. She moved around the house like a ghost, always one room ahead or behind. The cameras were still disabled. I left them that way. A few days later, Adam called me while he was at work. He said they'd read the letter, that they didn't want to fight, that they wanted to make things right. The following afternoon, we met in the dining room. I wore the navy sweater Michael had given me one Christmas long ago. I remembered how he used to call it my meeting sweater. He said I looked like someone who wouldn't be pushed around when I wore it. He would have liked this moment. John joined us via video call. Jessica sat with her arms crossed, but she said little. Adam did most of the talking. He said they agreed to repay the investment in full, that they would draw from the equity line and offer an additional stipend for relocation. He said they would remove all surveillance devices and provide a written statement acknowledging the breach of privacy. I listened. I nodded. I didn't gloat. I wasn't there to humiliate anyone. I was there to reclaim what I had given without recognition, what had been taken quietly over years, my time, my effort, my presence. By the end of the meeting, the terms were signed. John smiled through the screen. He said, "That's a clean exit," and I felt something in my chest unclench. The next week, I began looking for apartments. I didn't want anything grand, just a place that was mine. A small garden, a porch maybe, sunlight in the kitchen, a space where no one would catalog my movements, question my habits, or measure my value by how quietly I kept to myself. I found a one-bedroom cottage on the edge of town. It had a blue door and ivy along the back fence. The owner was a widow named Eleanor. She loved crossword puzzles and made fresh lemonade for every guest. We spoke for an hour on the porch before she handed me the keys and said, "I think you'll be happy here." I moved out quietly. No drama. No ceremony. I packed my things with care, folded the last few shirts, boxed up my books, wrapped the photo of Michael and me from our trip to Cape Cod. I didn't leave a note. I didn't owe them that. Adam helped me move the boxes. Jessica didn't come. I didn't expect her to. When he placed the last box down in my new living room, Adam stood for a moment looking around. He said the place felt calm, that it suited me. I offered him tea, but he declined. He looked unsure, like he wanted to say something meaningful but didn't know how. So I let the silence stand. We had said enough for now. As he stepped outside, he turned back once. He said, "Thank you, not for the past, but for the way I had handled the end of it." I closed the door behind him. I locked it gently. And for the first time in years, I felt like I was home. The first morning in the new cottage, I woke up just before sunrise, stirred not by obligation, but by something deeper. Curiosity, maybe, or a long dormant sense of calm. The air in the room was cool and still, the kind of stillness that doesn't make you feel alone, but held. I stretched slowly beneath the quilt, feeling no rush to rise, no footsteps in the hallway, no background hum of surveillance. I was unobserved, unmeasured, and that made the moment sacred. I stepped into the kitchen barefoot. The old hardwood floor creaked beneath me, but for once I didn't flinch. There was no one to scold me for making noise too early. I filled the kettle with water and placed it on the stove, humming a tune from memory, one I used to sing to Daniel when he was still small enough to cling to my hip. The sound filled the space, not loudly, but completely. While the water heated, I opened the back door and stepped outside. The garden was still mostly wild, a patchwork of ivy, rosemary, and flowers I couldn't name. Dew clung to the grass and shimmered in the early morning light. There were no fences visible from the back, just a slow slope of land disappearing into trees. I breathed it in. Later that morning, I unpacked the last of my books, arranging them not by size or color, but by memory. I put the old novels I read in college near the bottom shelf, the gardening manuals I had barely touched in the middle, and the poetry volumes, my secret indulgence, close to my armchair by the window. When I stepped back, it didn't look like a showroom. It looked like someone lived there, someone with a past. By the third day, I had developed new rituals. I ate when I was hungry, not when the house demanded. I napped without apology. I kept a small journal by the sink and wrote down little things that made me smile. A blue jay on the windowsill, the way the sun hit the kitchen tiles in the late afternoon, the sound of rain tapping the roof like fingertips. These details had once been swallowed in the noise of everyone else's needs. I bought a wine chime from the Sunday market, a handmade one with ceramic leaves. I hung it by the back door. Its song was uneven, but it made me feel less alone. I started writing short letters to myself, reminders of who I was before I became an accessory to someone else's life. They weren't long, just lines like, "You are not invisible here," or "Your life is not a debt owed to anyone." Daniel visited with the kids 2 weeks after I moved in. They ran through the small garden like it was a secret forest. I let them pick flowers. I let them get dirt on their knees. There was no one standing behind me, whispering about rules or stains or etiquette. Just me, the laughter of my grandchildren, and the scent of lemon verbena from the corner of the yard. When Daniel left, he looked at me longer than usual. He said, "You seem peaceful." I nodded. That was the word I hadn't dared hope for. I told him I was learning how to rest, truly rest, not collapse at the end of a long day of service, but rest in a space I chose, in a life I shaped. In the evenings, I would light candles, not because someone expected ambiance, but because I loved the flicker and warmth. I read poetry aloud, even if no one heard. I sang while folding laundry. I ate dessert first. I bought a used typewriter and typed small stories just to hear the click of the keys. I was no longer worried about usefulness. I was choosing joy. There were moments, of course, when memories surfaced. I would walk by a mirror and remember the little red light blinking in the ceiling. I'd recall the sound of Jessica's voice on that video, her cruel amusement. Those moments didn't wound me anymore. They clarified. They reminded me how far I had come. My home didn't have expensive art or voice-controlled lights, but it had windows that opened wide and let the air move freely. It had books that had actually been read. It had a table that held tea and bread and letters from friends. It had silence that wasn't empty. It had presence. I no longer worried about who was watching. There was no script to follow, no role to play. I was no longer the obedient guest or the quiet helper in someone else's life. I had shed those skins like winter coats in spring. My cottage was small, but within its walls I expanded. Every corner of that home bore my fingerprints, not because I was careful, but because I was finally free to leave a mark. I wasn't waiting to be noticed. I wasn't hoping to be thanked. I was living. And for the first time in years, every inch of space around me was exactly what I needed it to be: private, chosen, mine.